Good afternoon and welcome to the webinar hosted by the Investor Responsibility Research Center and Board Governance Research on our newest research report, the CEO Succession Planning Disclosure Matter. Our agenda today is introductions, an in-depth review of the research, a few words from the IRC Institute on their perspective on the research, and then we'll take your questions. In terms of the webinar logistics, all of the attendees are in listen-only mode during the webinar, but we do encourage your questions. On your control panel, you'll see a question pull-down box. Throughout the webinar, feel free to type your questions about the research into the question box. After the presenters have presented the research, we will read those questions aloud and respond to them. You will receive an email following this webinar with a link to a replay. We are recording it. You can download this report at www.ircinstitute.org. A copy of this PowerPoint slide presentation also will be available tomorrow. You can download that as well. And we also encourage you to share information on social media regarding the report if you're interested. The Twitter handles are there. If you have any audio issues during the webinar, please feel free to contact GoToMeeting at 1-800-263-6317. Our speakers today are two. The first is Annalisa Barrett. She's the author of the study. Annalisa has nearly 20 years of experience in the field of corporate governance and is the founder and CEO of Board Governance Research, LLC. The company provides independent research on corporate governance practices, board composition, and director demographics. She also is a full-time clinical professor of finance at the University of San Diego School of Business, where she teaches courses in corporate governance, financial statement analysis, and personal finance. And finally, Annalisa is a senior advisor for Value Edge Advisors, founded to advise institutional investors on effective corporate governance engagement to preserve portfolio value and diminish risk. Our second speaker today is John Lekumnik. He's Executive Director of the IRC Institute. He served in this role since the Institute was founded in 2008. Along with the Board of Directors, he's led the organization to become a leading source of objective academic and practitioner research on investment issues so that investors and policymakers can make data-driven decisions. John has decades of experience on investor issues, including serving as the investment advisor to the New York City pension funds. Just a couple words about the IRC Institute if you're not familiar with the organization. It's a nonprofit organization headquartered in New York City, and essentially what the organization does is it funds and disseminates that objective, unbiased research that's both focused on academic and practitioner research. The Institute hosts an annual research award with two $10,000 awards, so watch for information coming about that for this year's award process. And there's more than 40 research reports available at no charge that you can download on the website. The website was relaunched several months ago, and it's got a much more robust search function, so we encourage you to go visit the website and see what research is available. It's everything from a whole range of corporate governance issues, environmental issues, a range of issues that are of interest to investors. So with that, I will turn the presentation over to Annalisa, and she will run through the report. Annalisa?
Thank you, Kelly. I appreciate it, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you to everyone for joining us this afternoon. I'm very excited to be presenting the findings of this research project. We asked the question, does CEO succession planning disclosure matter? And first, let's just talk briefly about CEO succession planning. We can all agree, I believe, that the importance of CEO succession planning is well established. Both, boards of directors, executives, the companies agree, and shareholders agree as well that the issue is extremely important and undoubtedly one of the most important responsibilities of the board of directors. And for at least a decade, share owners have been calling for more disclosure, more information from boards about the plans that they have in place regarding CEO succession. And so we can go to the next slide and see that we have just a few examples here of quotes from governance guidelines, governance policies, and proxy voting guidelines, one from the Council of Institutional Investors, specifically calling for that disclosure to take place in the proxy statement. and one from BlackRock as well. And in the report, we also have quotes from TIA Crest, CalSTRS, and CalPERS, and undoubtedly there are many other institutional investors that are calling for this type of disclosure to be increased as well. On the next slide, we'll see that, the issues that the share owners are calling for to be disclosed when it comes to information regarding CEO succession planning are not specifics. There's no one is asking for a list of the CEO candidates. No one is asking for any information from the company that might cause either a competitive disadvantage for the company or an internal motivation factor challenge for the executives who may be, in line for consideration for the CEO position. But rather, what share owners are looking for is a confirmation that the board has taken the responsibility regarding planning for CEO succession seriously. They want to know, share owners really want to know who within the boardroom is responsible and accountable for overseeing the plan, that there is, in fact, an emergency plan in place in case there's an unexpected need for a new CEO. And then even, more specifics regarding how the board is involved with identifying CEO candidates. How are they exposed to high potential executives within the company, and how are they involved in the identification of potential candidates as a need may arise for a CEO change. So there may be some concern on the company side that share owners are looking for information that, would lead to a competitive disadvantage, but that isn't the case. But there is, some very significant information regarding these plans that share owners are looking for. On the next slide, we'll see the list of the goals of our study. So the question that we were asking is, yes, we all know that CEO succession planning is important. We know that share owners are calling for more information from the companies about this important responsibility that the boards have. However, many companies are not providing this level of detail, and the question is, why? Does it matter? Would it matter whether or not a company actually provided information regarding its succession planning process? And if indeed a company does provide that information in its annual disclosures, is that an indication of how the CEO change would actually go if it were to happen? So the goals were listed here. There were 3. The first was to look at the disclosure and actually see what companies are saying about their CEO succession planning process. And we specifically looked at companies that had a change in CEO during 2012 as a base year. We chose that year because we wanted to have a few years subsequent to the change, to the CEO succession planning event, in order to understand what happened afterwards, what was the outcome of that succession event. We also wanted to look at those companies to compare what actually happened in the event of the CEO change and how it compared to what their plan said would happen. The third thing was to examine the patterns, again, to answer that original question. Does it matter if we get additional disclosure from these companies? Does that give us any indication as to how successful the CEO change might be in the future? One challenge that we faced immediately is that, as you can see in the circle at the bottom of the slide, is that the goal to compare what was actually executed to a plan that was disclosed before a CEO succession took place wasn't possible because, as we'll discuss further, there was not enough information provided by the companies that had a CEO change in 2012. There wasn't enough information provided in the years prior to that change to even understand what the company had in mind in terms of the steps involved in the CEO succession plan. So unfortunately, that goal couldn't be achieved. And that is a significant finding in and of itself, that external observers are not able to actually kind of follow along with the CEO succession plan because there's not enough details provided by the companies. However, we were able to identify the patterns after looking at the disclosure, and so that's what we will talk about today. On the next slide, we'll see that that evidence of what I was referring to, the fact that there is a lack of CEO succession planning disclosure among companies. And interestingly, we can see here the prevalence moving significantly from 65% of the companies study discussing some aspect of a CEO succession plan in their proxy in 2010. That increased significantly to 73% in 2011 and 75% in 2012. And most likely that is due to changes that were made at the SEC, one of which being the proxy disclosure enhancement rules that were put into effect in February 2010. While these enhancements didn't require companies to address CEO succession planning specifically, what they did do is they addressed two other features of disclosure that are related. One is calling for an increase in disclosure regarding the board leadership structure in place at the company, and another is an increase in the discussion and a requirement for a discussion regarding the board's role in risk oversight. And we'll see later as we look at where the discussion regarding succession planning takes place that those two areas were prevalent in the discussions. And another change that took place at the SEC is that in the years leading up to 2009, there were several shareholder proposals voicing this concern or request for increased disclosure regarding CEO succession planning. And originally the SEC had excluded those. And then in I believe it was October of 2009, the SEC changed their stance and actually agreed that those proposals should be included because the issue was a governance issue rather than a day-to-day business issue. So we had increases in both of those in disclosure due to both of those issues. You can see in the first bullet, you can see that one of the most surprising findings was that almost a quarter of the companies that had a CEO succession event in 2012 did not provide any information, no reference to CEO succession planning at all in any of the three proxies studied in the proxy years that we looked at, 2010, 11, and 12. So we had no information from the company in their proxy statements regarding the issue. One quick note, the reason we looked at proxy statements regarding, for information regarding CEO succession planning is twofold. One, specifically, as noted in one of the quotes mentioned earlier, shareholders are specifically asking for the information to come in the proxy statement. Specifically, shareholders are looking for consistent information that's available in a convenient way and that's updated on a regular basis. And secondly, certainly committee charters and or companies' governance guidelines address this topic as well. However, for 2012, finding the charters and committee charters and governance guidelines that were in place and effective in that year was more challenging than finding the proxy statements that were readily available, obviously. So on the next slide, we can see information regarding where within the proxy this information shows up. So looking at these companies' proxy statements, we see that 13% of them actually had a section of the proxy dedicated specifically to CEO succession planning, so identified with a separate header and calling it out as an item specifically addressed in its own section. So that's not a lot of companies, but some companies did address it in that way. Over half of the companies, slightly over half, provided information regarding CEO succession planning in the section of the proxy statement discussing the responsibilities of the different board committees. And typically that was in providing information regarding the committee that was responsible, and we'll discuss that. 25% of the companies, interestingly, mentioned succession planning in the compensation discussion and analysis section of the proxy statement. And while some of these companies mentioned the topic more generally in that section, some actually specifically included CEO succession planning as a performance measure in either annual incentives or special incentives awarded to most often the CEO and or chairperson. And so that was an interesting finding and somewhat unexpected, I would say. As mentioned before, not surprisingly, we had nearly 1 in 5 of the companies that mentioned the succession planning topic in the discussion of the board's role in risk management, acknowledging that there are risks involved in not having an effective CEO succession plan in place, and that as part of the board's responsibility regarding risk management, they have addressed this topic as well. I was interested to find that a few of the companies mentioned succession planning as a skill, a specific skill in the list of skills that an individual director brings to the board, obviously, which is one of the increased disclosure enhancement changes that we saw as well. So the interesting thing is I looked at the directors who were identified as having succession planning as a skill that they bring to the board. And surprisingly, not all of those directors were currently, or in the 3 years studied, serving on the committee that had responsibility for oversight of succession planning. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there in terms of the use of that expertise in succession planning. But maybe they were previously on that committee or were going to be on that committee in the future. I'm not sure. The next slide shows us the discussions that were had in the proxy statement. So what was actually addressed in those discussions. And unfortunately, you can see the statistics on these bullets show that the percentages regarding the actual topics that shareowners are looking for boards to address in their disclosure are pretty rare. But to the extent that they existed, you can see 16% of the companies gave information regarding the role of the entire board in relation to CEO succession planning. And certainly it is the responsibility of the entire board ultimately, but this discussion is especially important when, in the common circumstance where the board has delegated the oversight of the succession plan to a specific committee. It's also helpful to know what role the entire board plays in that process as well. We see that 10% of the companies, they disclose how frequently the CEO succession plan is reviewed. Again, this is another item that many shareowners are calling for, information regarding how often that document is reviewed. One of the concerns, I believe, is that a succession plan being created is not not the end of the road for the plan. The plan needs to be a living document that is updated. It should be updated each time there's any change in circumstance among the leadership team at the company. It should be changed at any point in time that there is a CEO change or an anticipated one, any change in the health status of the current CEO, etc. The document should be something that is reviewed at least on an annual basis, is what many experts have said. And some of the companies that did provide this information in the proxy statement, did state that they do review the document on an annual basis. However, some did use some more vague language saying that they regularly review the plan. The next bullet is one of the big surprises for me as well. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, and that is that the only 8% of the companies studied actually mentioned the fact that there is an emergency succession plan in place. And this is one of the, I would think, very easy things to provide, pieces of information to provide to the share owners to at least reassure share owners that there is an emergency plan in place to be executed in the event that there's an unfortunate circumstance that befalls the existing CEO. And so even just mentioning the fact that there is that emergency plan was something that was very rarely mentioned, surprisingly. In only a few of the companies, only 2% of companies addressed the other topic that share owners are looking for, which is that piece of information regarding how the board is involved in being exposed to senior leaders, understanding which executives within the senior ranks have high potential for being in the path for the CEO position, or even mentioning what process the board uses to identify CEO candidates when the time arises. So only 2% of the companies studied even mentioned that issue at all. So as you can see, a lot of quite a bit of lacking information with regard to what companies are doing regarding this topic. And in fact, none of the companies, at least in the 2010, 11, 12 proxies, provided a really thorough, comprehensive discussion that met all of the needs and criteria that are being called for by the share owners. So on our next slide, what we're showing you is the approach that we use to evaluate whether or not a CEO transition was successful. And in order to develop this list, we did an extensive literature review looking at academic and practitioner studies of CEO changes and their effect on organizations. And so we selected these specifically looking at non-financial indicators as to the success of whether or not a CEO succession plan has been implemented. So the criteria that are listed here are the ones that we studied and evaluated. So the first one, looking at how long the CEO stayed in place. Again, we looked at transitions that took place in 2012, and so we had at least 2 years of proxy statements subsequent to that to see if the CEO was still in that role. We also looked at whether or not the CEO was named as a permanent CEO or as an interim CEO, and we'll discuss that further. We looked at whether or not an internal candidate was promoted to the CEO position or whether an external hire was brought in, and we'll see that in a few cases, in fact, a board member stepped in as CEO. And the other aspect of kind of the evaluation of a successful CEO transition is the timing of the process. And so we looked at that by looking at how quickly a new CEO was named after the departure was announced of the outgoing CEO. And then we also looked at when the actual formal announcement, the 8K, was filed regarding the departure of the CEO and how that compared to the effective date of the CEO change. You can imagine that the timing of the process can be an assessment of the effectiveness of the plan. And quite often, ideally, what happens is the CEO succession is announced months in advance. There is an announcement of the person who will be stepping into the CEO role after the outgoing CEO leaves the company, and there's a smooth transition and opportunity for even quite often overlap between those two people, so that there's an opportunity for internal, for employees within the company and for external observers to know that the CEO position is in good hands and that the execution of the strategic plan will continue as it has been outlined in the past. So the next slide shows us that the assessment as to whether or not the CEOs stayed on. So whether or not we're looking at whether or not the CEO that was named in 2012, the incoming CEO, continued to serve in that role. And again, we're looking at, we're looking for continuity here. And ideally, the goal of a successful CEO succession plan is for the new CEO to stay in place and be able to not disrupt the company by having another need for a new CEO in the near term. And 80% of the companies that had a permanent CEO named in 2012, that person was still serving as of the most recently filed proxy statement. However, so that sounds, that is a high percentage. However, that does mean that 1 in 5 of the companies that had a CEO change in 2012 had to go through the process again in a relatively short time frame. If we look at CEO tenure statistics, we see that according to the conference board, we have CEO tenure at 8 years. CEOs that departed their companies in 2012 had been there for 8 years. So we're looking at 2 or 3 years as a benchmark as to whether or not the succession plan was effective, and even still, 20% of the companies did not meet that threshold. So, we have, part of the review has shown that studies have shown that CEO change is expensive for companies in terms of the change in compensation plans. It's also disruptive for companies, and clearly the goal should be for it to not have to happen, in the short term. And so this finding is actually pretty striking, that 20% of the companies did in fact have to make a CEO change again. And then, so we wanted to know, okay, these CEOs were no longer serving in that 2 or 3 year period. Why did they leave the company? What was the reason for that departure? And you can see in the chart that, well, I should say one caveat here is that companies are quite often very cautious when they are providing a reason as to why the CEO is leaving his or her position, quite understandably. So the language that is provided in the 8K and or in the press release that is filed when the change takes place doesn't always give us the entire story. And so probably, I had several, examples of companies that made very general statements about the CEO's resignation, whether that be for family reasons or to pursue other interests, common phrases that we see in this type of disclosure. So that is reflected in that 48% that stated a resignation of some sort. But I call your attention to the 11% of companies that had, that were in this situation that had where a termination took place within a few years after the CEO change. So the board of directors presumably fired the CEO that they had brought in specifically, 2 or 3 years beforehand. And so that calls into question the process of the CEO succession plan, specifically wondering whether or not a sufficient vetting process was involved. And another 15% of the companies had faced a situation where the CEO retired a few years after taking the position. And while there may be circumstances where that makes sense, having that very short tenure of that CEO seems quite surprising, and again, may be an indication of a lack of an effective succession plan. The next slide shows the statistics regarding how common it was for an interim CEO to be named. And in fact, we had we had 39 companies, so 22% of the companies that were studied named an interim CEO in 2012 rather than naming a permanent CEO into the position. And many experts have opined that bringing in an interim CEO is not necessarily an indication of having an effective succession plan, and may be very disruptive because while that interim CEO is in that position, it is quite difficult to get to move things forward again regarding advancement of the strategic plan, and it also just leaves that uncertainty with the external observers, the share owners, and the Wall Street analysts, and everyone observing the company from the outside. So having an interim CEO is a concern for many people. And so we looked at these companies that had interim CEOs to see where the interim CEOs came from. And in about half of the cases, the interim CEO was an internal person. In about half of the cases, surprisingly, 46% of the cases, a board member stepped into that CEO role. Again, and that seems to be a clear indication of not having anyone either internally identified and ready to step into the role, or even having a plan for an external hire. Quite often that board member was the board chair, and so the board chair stepping in to take over that CEO role was a common practice. So interestingly, only 21% of the interim CEOs were actually converted to become permanent CEOs in the time frame studied. And so, in fact, this doesn't look like a path of naming someone as an interim CEO and then promoting them to the permanent position. In most of the cases, in fact, 79% of the cases, they served as interim CEO and then were not named as the permanent CEO. The next slide shows the results of the study as to where the permanent CEOs, now we're looking at the placement of those companies that had a permanent CEO named rather than an interim CEO, where they came from. Were they internal hires versus external hires? And this is an important question because several studies have found that an internal hire, as I mentioned previously, an internal hire is considered better in most circumstances. In a few circumstances, actually, one study that I saw indicated that if a company is in crisis, then it may be, in some circumstances, better to have an outsider come in. But for the most part, for most companies, it seems to be the best to have an internal candidate promoted to that CEO position. And in fact, in a little bit over half of the cases of the companies that changed CEO in 2012, that was the case. An internal candidate was promoted. And I looked at the positions that those internal candidates held before being named CEO, and for the majority of them, over half of them, were COO before being named CEO. We had a little bit over a third, 37%, where the company did have to go outside for that hire. And in fact, 7% of the companies named a board member permanently to serve as the CEO. And that also calls into question the effectiveness of the CEO succession plan, and it also can be seen as a problematic practice for other reasons as well. The next slide is an assessment, or shows the results of an assessment of the timing of the announcement. So as I mentioned previously, we wanted to look at, what was the communication process involved with the announcement regarding this CEO change. And as I mentioned, it's really important not only for the employees internally at the company who are being led by the CEO, but also for share owners and external observers to know what the plan is. And so that communication should be clear and it should be timely. And in fact, several of the governance guidelines from the institutional investors call for that specifically, that communication to be forthcoming in a timely manner. So the slide that's shown here shows the results of an assessment as to the specific date as to when the 8K announcing the departure of the CEO was filed in relation to the effective date of his or her departure. And so presumably you would announce the CEO's departure before that was going to take place. And of course, there are certain circumstances where that's impossible. And I should mention that these statistics don't include the few CEOs in our study that unfortunately did pass away while they were sitting CEO, who passed away during the 2012 base year. And so obviously in that circumstance, an 8K, can't be filed, an announcement can't be made before that were to happen. But so those circumstances were not included in this study, in this statistic. But it does show, if you look at the results, you see that a good portion of the announcements came on the same day. Over a quarter of the announcements came on the same day, which means that the 8K announced the departure of the CEO and said that that departure was effective immediately. In some circumstances, that may be appropriate if indeed it is a true firing of the CEO, but again, calls into question the overall planning process. And in 12% of the cases, the 8K was filed after the effective date. And not just one day after. I looked at one day before and after, but this was at least more than 24 hours or more than one day after that effective date of the CEO's departure. So let's go ahead and look at the last slide here of this portion of the discussion, and that is an assessment of everything coming together. Again, the question that we were asking was whether or not it does make a difference. The disclosure, are companies that provide more information to their share owners about their CEO succession plan, are they more likely to have successful CEO transitions when it does come to that? And in fact, as you can see from the statistics here, we found that companies that had successful CEO transitions, as evaluated by the categories that I just described, they were in fact more likely to have provided more robust disclosure regarding their CEO succession plan in the years prior to that change. And so we do see that, that information that is coming from the companies does seem to be, in line with the fact that a more effective CEO succession plan is in place. Now, we're certainly not claiming that there's any, causation. We're not saying that the fact that you have disclosed that you have a succession plan in place and provided information about it means in the future you're going to have a more successful CEO transition. But just the fact that the disclosure seems to be an indication that the board has given due attention to the matter and has seen it worthy of sharing the information with the share owners on a regular basis in that proxy statement. And when that's the case, we tend to see more successful CEO transitions take place. So that is the conclusion of the description of the study and its findings. And now I will turn it over to John for the viewpoint from the IRC Institute.
Great. Thank you very, very much. And I also want, while we're at an echo, and I apologize. I want to state that we are known very objective, sober research. Unfortunately, I think this is so. In fact, it's very. Kelly, I think we're getting feedback.
John, I'm having a little trouble with your audio. If you can look on that audio pull-down button and make sure you have it on telephone.
It's on telephone. And I think we're actually, we're hearing from your, so maybe.
Okay, let me mute myself. Maybe that's the problem.
So it's incredibly sobering research, in a lot of ways. As Annalisa said, I'm sorry, this is actually very distracting with the feedback. The appointing a CEO is universally acknowledged to be the key role for a board. And there are lots of things that people would like boards to do. I have never yet heard anyone, board, regulator, or investor or stakeholder claim that appointing and transitioning a CEO is not one of the core responsibilities of the board. So you would think that the board would want to affirm that they fulfill that responsibility. Unfortunately, as Annalisa just noted, nearly a quarter of the companies say nothing. Let me repeat that. A quarter of the companies that experienced a transition for the 3 years prior said nothing at all about what their succession planning was. Those that do often lack relevant detail or any detail. Nearly a half don't even say which committee is responsible or whether it's the board as a whole. Only 1 in 10 say how often the board reviews the succession planning process. And as you will recall from the slide, there are a lot of 2% and 8% there, numbers for things like how you actually review your talent or whether you have an emergency plan. Now, let me say what this is not. This is not a prevalence review. We are not looking at current disclosure and saying this applies to all companies. But let me say what it is. It is a base year study so that we could look before and after to see what happened. And so these are companies which experienced a CEO transition within roughly 2 to 3 years of those disclosures, and in some cases within months of the last disclosure we looked at. So you would think some of them had to know it was coming. So you would think that this sample set would skew towards robust disclosure. This is anything but robust disclosure. I've had this report for about a month now, looking at it and going back and forth, making sure that I understood it, and it's actually really distressing. Next slide, please. Now, we don't know if the lack of clear disclosure is reflective of poor succession planning or poor disclosure. But as Annalisa proved, we do know that there's a correlation between better disclosure of succession planning and better CEO transitions. Now, that is, first off, intuitive. And I got a call from a lawyer who read the report and said, well, of course, disclosure means they've thought about it and planned. Of course they had better transitions. So taking that to heart and sort of, it's intuitive, but if you actually reverse engineer your intuition, you come up with some advice to boards. The first advice is disclose. Say something. Say anything. For the quarter of the boards who say nothing, that's an improvement. The next step is disclose relevantly. As Annalisa noted, no one is looking for proprietary information or a list of your top candidates so that executive search firms can pick them off. What investors are looking for and what the board should be doing is determining a process. Who's responsible? Is it the board as a whole? Is it a committee? How does the board review what a committee does? How frequently do you do it? And then all those other issues, such as how do you review internal talent? Do you have an emergency succession plan? It strikes me that that is a very low bar to set for disclosure, and they're failing to meet even that low bar. I know this is more passionate than I sound on most of these calls, but I just can't believe some of the findings in this report. Next slide, please. You know, there's a quote that is attributed somewhat apocryphally to Albert Einstein, saying if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. Well, CEO succession is important enough that boards should show that they understand it well enough. Simply disclose. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kelly and see if we have any questions from the audience. Thank you.
Terrific. I will move to the Q&A portion of the webinar. Just as a reminder, there's a question box on your pull-down menu. You can type in your question there. We'll read it aloud, and John or Annalisa will respond to it. So let me check into the questions. The first one we have, did you consider using TSR or revenue growth as a success measure?
Yeah, I can answer that. So we did think about doing a study regarding the financial performance of the companies following the CEO transition. However, for a couple of reasons we didn't. One is that several different studies have looked at that already, and those were the studies that we used to identify the non-financial measures. So I would point you to studies done by Spencer Stewart and Strategy and prevalence studies done by the Conference Board for those types of analyses. Specifically, we wanted to look at the non-financial indicators of success, especially because we were looking at a rather short-term time frame post CEO change, and presumably most share owners will be looking at that financial performance over a longer time frame than we had available to us to study. However, it would be, it definitely would be interesting to go back now that we've completed this portion of the study and to look at the financials as well. But that was the reason we chose the non-financial indicators and relied on existing studies to identify the non-financial indicators of success of a transition.
Thank you. Our next question, are you aware of any companies that make succession planning or cultivation and retention of top talent an explicit element of the CEO's performance evaluation or incentive compensation?
Yes, in fact, in the study there is an appendix that provides some examples of that specifically. So as I mentioned, 25% of the companies studied mentioned succession planning in the CD&A, but in fact, I actually provided in the appendix a list of companies that had specifically cited succession planning or CEO succession planning as a performance measure, either in an incentive plan or in a special retention award or some specific performance measure criteria in an incentive plan. And so you can see a list of those in the appendix in the study.
And just as a reminder, the report, including the appendix, obviously, is available free of charge. It's ircinstitute.org.
Thank you. Our next question, do you have plans to look for any correlation between succession plan robustness or disclosure and other governance elements like CEO chair split or presence of significant shareholders?
Oh, that's a wonderful idea. I like that idea a lot. I hadn't planned on doing that specific follow-on, but I think that would be a great idea to see what other governance practices are prevalent at these companies that seem to have robust CEO succession planning. I think that's a great idea. Thank you.
Our next question, do you have an idea why internal promotions rather than external/recruited CEOs were considered successful?
Oh, yes. The studies show two things. First, that the disruption from having an outsider come in and have to come up to speed, so to speak, was quite disruptive in terms of execution of strategic plan, and also the expenses related to the hiring of an external CEO have been proven. My colleague Paul Hodgson at the Corporate Library had a study years ago that showed the expenses related to hiring an external CEO much higher than an internal hire as well.
Thank you. The next question, I can take this one. As a participant in the webinar, will we get a copy of the slide deck being presented? This presentation will be posted by tomorrow on the IRRC website. We'll also send out an email with a link to the PowerPoint present and a replay of this webinar. The next question, in regards to the CEO stay pie chart, what does changed position mean? He or she transitioned to a non-executive position or some other executive position?
Yes, exactly. So in some cases, in a few cases there, I think I have it in front of me now, the percentage, I don't have. Did the COC? Yes, 11% of the cases. So a few of the CEOs changed to a different position at the company. And if I recall, a few of those changed to a chief scientific officer or still in the executive ranks, but not in a CEO role.
Thank you. Our next question, from recent research or on later public disclosures, have you noticed better disclosure by companies on their succession planning since 2012?
I would say yes, and I would point you to the studies done by the conference board for information on at least the S&P 500, and those companies do seem to have increased their discussion. However, what hasn't been done, I believe, is a review of the companies that indeed had a CEO change. So we do show increases in prevalence of disclosure the conference board does show improved disclosure at the companies in the S&P 500, but not necessarily. I don't know about looking at the companies with CEO changes in fact.
Our next question, do you think boards freeze up because they have not done it, or because they just don't know what to do, or because the current CEO is blocking? Why do you think there is no disclosure?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's a few things going on. I think in some cases, the board, I think in many cases, I should say, in many cases, the boards do have a robust discussion about CEO succession planning, and it is a standing agenda item in executive sessions quite often. However, committing that to paper may be the concern, and I think there may be even a misunderstanding among boards about what specifically the shareholders are looking for in the disclosure. Several directors I spoke to about this research mentioned that, of course, we have a robust, succession plan, but we aren't going to tell anyone about it because that's internal information that is for the board's eyes only. And so some of it may be just a disconnect between what is being sought and what is in place. In other circumstances, though, I do fear that that there are companies where the board does not necessarily have a plan and or does not have an updated plan that would be ready to implement at a moment's notice.
Thank you. Our next question, you mentioned that there may be problems with a director taking over as CEO. What problems can arise from that type of arrangement?
Yeah, so I think this is actually an interesting topic to explore maybe in future research, but there is concern that if a director is, serving as an independent director of the board, however, has an eye on the CEO's job, then their independence would certainly be in question. And so if there's a perception or a fact that a director has, a goal for taking over as CEO, then that person is probably not best served as a director and shouldn't be in that position. So there's some concern over their intentions and their independence in that circumstance. And I know we've seen it recently in a few circumstances where directors have come in to serve as CEO, and it would be interesting to see the outcomes of those transitions as well.
There are two other concerns, and this isn't to say that they should be total bars on the practice, but they're concerns. First, when you're looking for a CEO, you want to have either a plan for an internal succession. You've watched candidate A or candidate B, and you've seen them through the years, and you have a sense of them. You know they can do the job, or you think they can do the job. If not, you want to have broad search in the best possible person. Selecting a director is akin a little bit to the way directors used to be selected to be on the board, which is, who do we know? They're already in the room. Hey, Bob or Susan is here, and why don't we pick them? And that is not exactly a robust search process. So the two concerns are, number one, it's indicative of a failed process, and number two, you're not considering the widest possible opportunity set. You're going to go externally anyway.
Thank you. Our next question, why do you think directors are reluctant to disclose more information about their CEO succession plans?
Yeah, and that goes to that comment I was making earlier about the fact that I think there is concern that the information regarding the CEO succession plan as a whole should be kept inside the boardroom because it does, by its nature, include some competitive information and some information that may, list specific candidates and their capabilities and likelihood to take over as CEO. And that information is not what the share owners are looking for. And so I think there may be a concern on the part of directors that, that the information should be kept internal because it does have that aspect of it which could be competitive in nature. But they may not be considering the fact that there is information that would be helpful and perfectly appropriate to disclose that share owners are seeking.
Thank you. And that looks like that concludes our questions for the webinar.
It looks like we lost Kelly, so I will thank everyone, and I apologize for the audio problems. Thankfully, it was at the end. So thanks very much. The research is available at ircinstitute.org, and let me thank Annalisa again. The contact information looks like Kelly has put up on the screen. I don't quite know what was happening with the audio today. We will fix it for the next time. Thanks very much, and have a good evening. Bye.
Thank you so much.